child, my mother thought me divine, my father weak. Which am I, Hephaestion? Weak or divine?
Welcome to Not Another Greek History Podcast, the podcast that aims to be exactly what it says. I'm your host, Onouphrios Dovletis, and together we'll discover the not-so-frequently told stories of Greece's history that will change the way you view things forever. In another symbolical move after his visit at the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, Alexander visits the Oracle of Siwa in Egypt, and there he is declared the son of Zeus Ammon. This place is like 8 hours from Alexandria. I've actually been there. For Alexander, it might have taken maybe over a week. It's very close to the borders with Libya, which is like 30 miles away. It's very close. Siwa is an oasis, but you should just imagine a small town in the desert, because when we hear the word oasis, I think we all have in mind something very spectacular appearing out of the blue in the desert with some lakes, palm trees, very idyllic and all that, and it's not. It's nothing like that. So that's what the oracle of god Amun-Ra was. Amun-Ra. I love this name, by the way. And I guess from things like this is where the name Mom-Ra, the character from the cartoon Thundercats, came from. That's something that I grew up with. And you'll see why I'm saying that.
Ancient spirits of evil, transform this decayed form to Mum-Ra, the ever-living!
In the Netflix documentary that was made about Alexander the Great, and which I'm going to be talking about at some point during this episode, there's this really over-the-top scene at Siwa where it really felt like Mum-Ra would make an appearance. A Persian king, by the way, had attempted to visit the oracle 2 centuries earlier, but failed. So Alexander's intention was to show that he, unlike the Persians, would succeed. The story says that Alexander followed some birds to find his way. It's a very magical description of this whole journey where all the omens happen. There's birds showing him the way. A lot of impressive things that, of course, were added to embellish this narrative. The Temple of Amun is where Alexander the Great was addressed as son of Zeus. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was supposedly impregnated by a thunderbolt, which is a symbol of Zeus, of course. Another story says that Philip saw Olympias in bed with a snake, which was a symbol of Dionysus, the god of wine, or Ammon. That meant that it was the god that got her pregnant. And because he was peeping through the keyhole, because Philip was peeping through the keyhole, the god eventually caused him to lose his eye. As we mentioned, by the way, in the episode that was about him and his wife in the famous Macedonian series. And I will put it in this episode's description. Nevertheless, it is said that Alexander was also afraid of the vengeance of the unpredictable god of wine. That is because the god's mother was from Thebes, a city very close to Athens. That was a place that Alexander had destroyed, as we've mentioned already. Apparently, his guilt tormented him. Interestingly, the most famous tragedy featuring Dionysus, or Bacchus, which is also what the Greeks called him, it's called Bacchae, I guess in English, Bacchae in Greek. It was written in Pella, in Macedonia, and not in another part of Greece, not in Thebes. It was written in Macedonia, but by the Athenian playwright called Euripides. In that incredible play, Bacchus as the protagonist, so we have a god being a character of the play and also the main character. He possesses the women of the city who tear the king to pieces, and his mother parades her own son's head as a trophy. The play premiered at the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. Theater of Dionysus in Athens, though. The one that we actually see below the Acropolis that I always tell tourists, and I'm going to tell you, or maybe I've told you if you've met me and you're listening to this episode, that this is the first theater in the world. That's what someone can see when you visit Athens, by the way. And of course, this madness that this amazing playwright called Euripides created couldn't help but capture the audience, winning him the first prize in the annual theater festival of Athens. Some writers say that Alexander's mother denied such stories, so these could be stories that were made after his death, or maybe even by him during his lifetime, who knows. Some of his troops even made fun of his alleged connection to the gods. Nevertheless, after his death, he was depicted with horns on coins. The horns were associated with Ammon Zeus. That's why much later he was mentioned in the Quran, so for the Muslims, as Dhul Qarnayn, which is Arabic for the two-horned one. So actually at this point, we're just going to listen to a very small part from a Greek song which refers to this, the two-horned Alexander. It says, the star of Eye, from the land of Macedonia to the Pamir, across the known world, he spread the Greek language. He was never defeated by anyone. History first named him the Great, and now the whole world says, Iskander, Sikander, Dhul Qarnayn. Alexander never minted coins with his own image, by the way. So whatever depiction we have of him on a coin, it was done by his successors to practically make a connection to Alexander the great emperor of this whole empire. Siwa, the oasis where he went to the oracle of Siwa of Ammon, is thought to be one of his possible burial places, according to his own wishes. After all this, King Darius loses Egypt for good, and with it, a vital part of his empire. That's because Egypt provided not just grain, but also gold. Then Alexander wins the Battle of Gaugamela, as we've heard Colin Farrell say in the movie Alexander. I think it's really funny the way he says the word Gaugamela. Look at the map on your phones. This was near modern-day Erbil in Iraq. Erbil. That's E-R-B-I-L, by the way. Before the Battle of Gavramila, that's how we say it in Greek. Gavramila. Which actually, this is the sound that we make for a dog barking. Because obviously, you might know, dogs bark in a very different way in most languages. In Greek, dogs bark like rav rav. That's what we do. Rav rav. So Gavramila. So before the Battle of Gaugamela, he said to the army, "Stand with me and let us prove to the world that Greeks fear no force." That shows his Greek identity. By the way, that's something that I really appreciated in the Oliver Stone film that I told you, because they constantly show his Greek identity. So let's hear this from the movie by Oliver Stone.
You will answer with all the strength of your great hearts. I was here this day at Gaugamela for the freedom and glory of Greece. Zeus be with us.
Alexander faces Darius 2 years after the last time that they met. It was at this battle that Alexander definitively defeats the Persian king. Darius again flees the battle. And yet, you have historians of the Netflix docudrama about Alexander calling this not an act of cowardice, but an act of statecraft. Like, oh my god, seriously? How biased is that? That's actually statecraft. The king had been completely discredited. He was soon murdered by one of his own men in 330. Darius had only ruled for 6 years, so he was not some great legendary king that had ruled for a very long time. It was only 6 years, and out of those, only two were Alexander free, let's say. That man was tormented, he was haunted by Alexander. But Alexander respected the Persian king and gave him a full burial ceremony at Persepolis, the capital. He even hunted down and executed Bessus, the man who killed Darius, and he did it in an imaginative way. Two straight trees were bent together, and a part of his body fastened to each, wrote Plutarch. You can obviously imagine what happened to Bessus when the trees were set free. The king's death marked the end of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. French writer Voltaire wrote about this. What we can say with absolute certainty is that Alexander, at the age of 24, had already conquered Persia with just 3 battles, that he had such grandeur and courage, and that he changed the face of Asia, Greece, Egypt, and the commerce of the world. Alexander easily captures the Persian capitals of Babylon and Susa, but Persepolis was harder to get. That's why he allowed his soldiers to burn it down. The Persians themselves had burned down anyway several Greek cities when they had invaded Greece 150 years earlier, including Athens. Alexander obviously knew how to take revenge, which is what this war was about, anyway. Even so, he dressed like the Persians. The Greeks even accused him of becoming Persian. The ultimate irony would be that much later, Persian became the language of high culture and literature for centuries in Turkic courts. The Ottomans, the Turks, the Ottomans used a blend of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. And since the Turks occupied Greece in some areas for over 500 years, the Greeks ended up using Persian words, but through their contact with the Turks. Imagine that when I started learning Arabic, I already knew a lot of words, because there's a connection, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Persian administrative models were adopted by Turkish rulers. Their music combined Persian, Arabic, Greek, and Turkic elements, and Turkish cuisine owes much to Persian cooking as well. The wealth that came out of the Persian treasuries would be several billions today, and Alexander made sure to distribute some of that money to his own soldiers. That was one of the reasons that kept them going. Alexander, by the way, was renowned for his generosity. There's a story mentioned by Plutarch that shows that. Though the son of Mazeus, the most influential man at the court of Darius, already had a province that he ruled, Alexander gave him a second and a larger one. He, however, declined it, saying, "O king, formerly there was one Darius, but now you have made many Alexanders." So he was giving a lot of power, a lot of wealth to so many people that they could even compare themselves to Alexander himself, and he was okay with that. With the death of Darius, Alexander's goal had finally been achieved. Of course, his army then thought that they would finally return to Greece. But no, he wanted to go on. After the conquest of the Persian capitals, he pretty much let his allies go back to Greece, keeping the Macedonians, so the people from his city-state, from his kingdom, and employing mercenaries. Babylon that we mentioned was near Baghdad in Iraq. Susa is in Iran, so it is in what practically is the Persian state. And you can just look for all of those things on your maps. Persepolis also is in Iran. The city was known as Parsa, which means the city of the Persians. The Greek name Persepolis means exactly that. So when you say Persepolis, you're actually using a Greek word for that, because polis always means city in Greek. At this point, I want to tell you something funny. Whenever I have Iranian or Persian people in a tour, it's the same, they seem to hold this against the Greeks. We, on the other hand, don't hold it against them. Although, as I've simply said to them, and which also Alexander mentioned in his letter, you started it. It's mind-boggling when you hear professors, also, even professors, saying stuff like, the Persians were minding their own business, but the Greeks provoked them. That was actually said by an Iranian professor, Kamyar Abdi, who even studied in the United States. So you would expect maybe something less biased by someone who has studied abroad and not just in Iran. I'm afraid, though, that the whole thing began when Cyrus the Great conquered Greek cities of Ionia or Asia Minor, or even, to make it, let's say, more modern, of Western Turkey around 550 BC. The destruction of Athens is happening 70 years later, and the revenge of Alexander 2 centuries later. So they really started it, and they came back, and then they came back, until eventually the Greeks went to them, and they kicked their asses. Also, as I was watching the BBC documentary In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great with Michael Wood, it was so strange to me to see Iranian people talk about Alexander in a very derogatory way. They even called him devil and cursed. Devil because of the 2 horns that we mentioned that had to do with Ammon Zeus. While Alexander embraced his association with divinity for political purposes, there was no evidence that he actually wore anything with horns on it. That was done only as a visual metaphor by artists and rulers much later, as we said, because they wanted to make a connection with the incredible ruler called Alexander the Great. So to really put this into perspective, a nation, unprovoked, invaded another. Then they were defeated and thus humiliated. Then later, they get punished for that invasion, and yet they are the ones that are holding a grudge. And this is even happening 2,500 years later. I really think that something went wrong here. I also grew up with these stories, obviously from the perspective of greatness, that it was such an amazing thing for Alexander to go to the Persian Empire, take them over, and so on. Each nation focuses on what is convenient and what drives the people. We all get it. But okay, when you grow up, and no matter how difficult it might be, it's up to you to see the big picture. I don't read these stories where the Greeks are killing random people in India and go, yeah, way to go, Greeks. Just kill more people for no reason. I'm not crazy. That's why I want to provide a balanced view. I hope I'm doing it. I don't know. And I want to avoid both this outright glorification that you see sometimes, but also this undue criticism. I'm actually trying to figure this Alexander guy out. Regarding criticism towards Alexander, that goes back already in antiquity, so it's nothing new. Don't think that we're doing something that is very subversive and we're criticizing Alexander and so on that I sometimes see in documentaries. People have criticized him for thousands of years. Some Romans actually criticized him, the very people that adored and admired him more than anyone else. Lucan, a 1st century AD poet who was a nephew of Seneca, called Alexander a plague on earth, a lightning bolt that struck all peoples alike, a fateful comet flaring over every nation. Yeah, that was a bit dramatic, Lucan. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who was his uncle, didn't exactly admire Alexander either. He often used him as an example of unchecked ambition, greed, and the destructive nature of excessive power. Really? The Romans criticizing things like that? Okay. His writings focus on Alexander's flaws rather than his achievements. So Seneca wrote, "The obsession with destroying the goods of others drove poor Alexander and cast him into the unknown." Can we see spiritual health in a man who began by attacking Greece, his teacher, seizing from every state its most valuable possession, independence from the Spartans, the right of speech from the Athenians, and then, unsatisfied with the destruction of so many cities that Philip had conquered with arms or with money, went on to disturb other cities here and there, crossing the entire earth with his army, his cruelty never exhausting itself or stopping, like a wild beast that, driven by hunger, is ready to bite. It's a bit ironic for a philosopher living in an empire built on conquest to wag his finger at Alexander for doing the same thing. You could say Seneca was a bit of a hypocrite, or that he had a blind spot for Roman imperialism while pointing out similar flaws in others. But I'm going to be nice, and I'll say that Seneca might have been using Alexander not just to take a jab at a historical figure, but to hold up a mirror to the Romans without directly confronting them. And that was part of his broader Stoic philosophy. The irony is that Stoicism was a Greek philosophical movement. So now we are in 327 BC. Alexander marries Roxana, a Bactrian princess, to solidify, of course, relations with local populations. And I just rhymed. This is happening in a place called Bactra, or Bactra in English, which is modern-day Balkh in Afghanistan. One of Alexander's methods of integrating conquered territories was to promote marriages between Greeks and locals, founding cities, and spreading Greek culture. By the way, a recurring thing in most movies about antiquity is using actors who are older than the age of the historical person. Colin Farrell, who played Alexander, was 28 when Alexander was 20 and 20 plus, but okay, let's say that it's not a huge deal. In the 1956 movie with Richard Burton, though, the actor even plays the teenage Alexander, although he was 30. And that's a huge difference there. In the 2004 movie, Angelina Jolie, who plays Alexander's mother, is only 1 year older than Colin Farrell. In reality, Olympias was 19 years older than Alexander. In the case of Roxana, it's even more inaccurate because actress Rosario Dawson was 25 at that moment. But Roxana was a teenager when she married Alexander, maybe 15 years old, so we should be seeing a child, not a grown woman. After the wedding with Roxana, Alexander then begins his campaign into India. In Greek mythology, god Dionysus is sometimes portrayed as having led a campaign to conquer India. This narrative likely developed as part of the broader tradition of depicting Dionysus as a wanderer who spread viticulture and civilization to distant lands. The army of Dionysus included satyrs, maenads, and exotic animals, which emphasized his divine and also chaotic nature. His followers used music, dance, and intoxicants to disarm and convert their enemies. What a lovely army, right? After Alexander's campaign in India, Greek authors often drew comparisons between him and Dionysus. We have already mentioned that according to legend, Dionysus even got his mother pregnant, Olympias. So the god was his father. Moreover, in Egypt, Dionysus could be identified with Osiris. Alexander, of course, embraced all this connection and presented his conquests as a continuation of the god's mythical journey to the east. The myth thus gained renewed significance in the Hellenistic period. What is certain is that in Greek imagination, India was a distant, mysterious, and exotic land. As Dionysus supposedly himself says in an ancient book, "We march not as destroyers, but as bringers of joy, bearing the gift of wine to tame the untamed lands. With vines we conquer, with music we disarm, and with ecstasy we shall enthrone ourselves in the hearts of men. No wall shall stand, no army resist the madness of Bacchus. Onward, to India, where the rivers flow like veins of the earth, and the forests murmur songs of mystery and promise." 326 BC. Roxana probably gives birth to a child that dies in what is now Pakistan. But there in India, the army of Alexander also faces the monsoon. Keep in mind that Greece doesn't have such harsh weather phenomena. It is colder in Macedonia compared to the rest of Greece, but there is no way that the Greeks were prepared for that. Alexander defeats King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, his most challenging battle. The iconic scene from Oliver Stone's movie where Alexander charges Porus with his horse, whereas Porus throws a javelin from his elephant, was one of my favorite ones. It actually comes from ancient coins. It was depicted on the coins in antiquity. This is very impressive. It's an iconic scene. You have to watch that. It was probably at this battle where Alexander's beloved horse that we mentioned in the very beginning, that was tamed by Alexander when he was just a child, and it was called Bucephalus. That's where the horse probably died. It was an old horse, roughly 30 years old, and imagine also what the poor animal had gone through all these years traveling from Greece all the way up to India and taking part in battles. Alexander even named a city after his horse, Alexandria Vucephala. It was probably located near modern-day Jalalpur. The Hydaspes River is now called Jhelum, and it's in modern-day Pakistan, in Punjab, about 2 hours from the capital Islamabad. Punjab means land of 5 rivers. The Hydaspes is the first river. In Sanskrit, the river was known as Vitasta. The Greek name Hydaspes for this river comes from this interaction with the local languages during Alexander's conquest. So from Vitasta we go to Hydaspes. I guess this is also relatively close to K2, which is the second highest mountain on Earth after Mount Everest. We're talking about 8,611 meters or over 28,000 feet. The distance those people covered back then is unprecedented, covering about 30 kilometers a day, in some cases up to 80. Plutarch wrote, "For Alexander, no place was hard to get at, and there was no stronghold impregnable." And keep in mind that the king himself is leading the campaign. This is not an empire being created by the orders of the king. The king is there. He's one of the boys. Alexander literally grew up within the army. A lot of the men were much older than him, having fought with Philip under his command. But Alexander was 20 when his campaign is beginning, and now he's 30 years old. As his friend Hephaestion suggests in the movie, Alexander was willing to come to these extremes, probably to run away from his mother.
I wonder sometimes if it's not your mother you run from. So many years, so many miles between you. What is it you fear?
Who knows these things?
Nevertheless, in the Alexander romance, as Alexander journeys to the edges of the known world, he writes to his mother Olympias, recounting his adventures. Mother, I have stood at the edge of the earth, where the sun dips into the ocean. I have faced monsters and gods alike, but my heart longs for the olive groves of home and the embrace of my mother's arms. At this point, they have realized that the world was actually much bigger than what they had believed. But he's willing to continue. I think maybe that's how eager he was to discover the world and go where no other Greek had ever gone. Maybe that's how much he didn't want to be alone. Alexander reached the Beas River, the easternmost point of his conquests. His army, exhausted after years of campaigning, refused to march further into India. But none of the ancient sources ever mention any talk of Alexander having any plans to return to Greece. According to the fantastical Alexander romance novel, Alexander meets Indian philosophers, the Brahmans, who challenge his ambitions and question his quest for conquest. King of Macedonia, what is the purpose of your endless wars? Gold cannot buy wisdom, nor can power conquer death. Return to your homeland and live a life of virtue. Alexander eventually agrees to put an end to his campaign. And we're not done. This is to be continued in the next episode, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share. Until next time, this is Onoufiros Dovletis signing off from Not Another Greek History Podcast.